Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for our webinar today, which is Planning for Sustainability, Joining the Many Dots. So the theme of today is to really delve into the challenges and the relationships that we experience between the various disciplines of sustainability while going through this planning application stage. As I'm sure almost everyone on the call will be aware that the requirements, the policies, the expectations around sustainability and broader environmental requirements are getting stronger and more prominent by the year, or even by the month at this point in time. And as well as it being very exciting for the way that we're approaching the built environment, it actually obviously causes a bit of more complexity, and there is a need for us to better understand the relationships between the different aspects of sustainability to make sure that our planning applications are smooth, timely, and done as cost efficiently as possible. So our intention today is to look at some of these relationships and really try and get across as best we can, based on our experience, how to balance these different objectives and how to look at the big picture. So first of all, just an introduction to us and 8 associates, so you understand a bit better about where we're coming from and our perspective on all matters related to sustainability. So we are a multidisciplinary sustainability consultancy, so we do all technical aspects relating to sustainability, from kind of carbon footprinting right through to ecology and biodiversity, and also many things related to environmental science, pollution and certification and all those kind of good things. And most recently we have the net zero agenda, which is really increasing in its kind of pace and coverage, and particularly from a planning perspective as well. We're getting a great deal of engagement from the planners at the local authority, who are asking even many questions and requirements that are over and above the say the local plan in relation to carbon footprinting and carbon net zero, and it's really something that's growing in its general understanding and prevalence. So it's something we need to be very mindful of. So we have people across all different expertise, and our role really in relation to planning applications and supporting people with getting through that planning phase in relation to design and the actual process. We support with all the technical aspects, from all the environmental sciences through to the carbon, the energy and ecology, all the surveys and that kind of thing. And our job really is to integrate all of these, see the big picture, and make the planning process as smooth as it possibly can be. So 5 steps on our agenda today. The first one really is to understand the actual planning requirements and policy requirements around sustainability. Now, these slides are quite heavy. There's quite a lot of detail on the policy, because we want to make sure that you have that detail. And we are recording today, and we will make the recording available. So I won't go into much detail about the specific policies themselves, but please see my narrative and my comments over on the slides as more advice and guidance and input and comment as to general narratives as to how we should approach these various disciplines when we're communicating with the planners, producing the reports, and generally in a kind of broader design philosophy. Second section is looking at design discipline impacts, and this is just really trying to clarify some of the key aspects of sustainability and their impacts on the key design disciplines, so structural engineers, architects, MEP, etc. Then we also need to understand some of the trade-offs, so how the sustainability themes impact on one another, and there are many areas where a change in one will affect another, and if we understand that, we can avoid impacts on cost and delays, etc. And also risk management. How do we actually manage the risk of these things going the wrong way, and also impacting on delivery times and such things. And then finally, our kind of real top 5 tips for coordinating all of this big picture to make sure we have a successful application. So starting with the really the requirements and the kind of disciplines for sustainability, broadly speaking, we can summarize all of the requirements that we need to be considering into these categories. So generally, when we're looking at these themes, obviously there are multiple studies that may feed into any one of these themes, but these are the big five that we need to really really be considering. And also we will be looking primarily from a London-centric perspective because of the London plan, which is really probably the most progressive and advanced policy suite in terms of sustainability. But as we are seeing, London tends to go first in this respect, and then other parts of the country tend to follow. We have increasingly demanding policy requirements in different regions and different areas, and also we have sustainability requirements being embedded at the national level as well. So the sustainability planning requirements for each of these themes. So first and foremost, which is obviously getting the most coverage at this point in time, is energy and the zero carbon agenda. Now, this is really what we need to be demonstrating. You all be aware of this energy hierarchy, but the key point is we need to demonstrate how we've gone through that. And when we're looking at how we're presenting our reports, our content, our narrative, we need to be demonstrating this cycle, this step process as to how we've gone through this this kind of hierarchy and how it's documented. And that's really the secret to getting the buy-in from the local authority is to see that step-by-step process. We can't just present the end result. We've got to show the process. So where these hard and fast requirements actually come in, particularly in relation to the London plan, we now have minimum requirements for passive design, and that's really around the architectural side of things. So that's optimizing the fabric design and the building envelope design. That's really, really important, and this is often the sticking point that we experience where we get locked in perhaps to a particular architectural design, and then we're really struggling and battling to hit these requirements. But this is often something that trips up some designs and some applications, but we need to demonstrate these, and these really are embedded in the policy, and they're becoming much more, I suppose, a part of compliance or not. Also, it's worth noting that with the latest version of the London plan, we also have requirements around monitoring, and we're basically seeing more requirements that need to be actioned after the planning design and even the construction phase. So now we need to report, for example, for 5 years after completion, the energy consumption of the development. That's also something we need to make sure that we're managing. We also have a life cycle assessment requirement, which really is at as-built stage. So we're seeing this kind of elongation of some of the sustainability requirements to really completion and beyond. So we still have the demand or the expectation or the desire to look to integrate energy systems as much as possible. So that's connecting to existing networks and master plans. There is still that preference and that theme running through many planning policies, and that the expectation and the general theory is that the integrating into larger networks is considered to be more efficient. With the changing of the carbon factors, which we will come on to just shortly, well, it's really impacting the type of technology. So, for example, there's no chance we can get a CHP through planning now because of the high carbon factor of gas relative to electricity, and even gas boilers really are a challenge. So we're really in the phase now where if we see gas in a scheme, or if we know there's gas in a scheme, we know we're going to have one heck of a fight with the local authority in trying to get it through, because it's on carbon terms it's very hard to justify. So that's one thing to watch out for, is the technology is being heavily influenced by the policy. So this is really our crib sheet for you to kind of, I would consider these if you're looking at making an application in Greater London, or for that matter, if you wanted a high performing energy and low carbon scheme, this would be your 9-point plan to check that these points that we're hitting. This is really considered. This is really the minimal practice in London, and probably could be considered good or best practice elsewhere in the UK. But you want to be looking through your energy assessment documents and everything related to the energy and carbon to check that all of these aspects are ticked, because this will be what we're being judged against when the application goes in. Next is overheating. So what is this? This is really, as we know, we have, particularly in a lot of office buildings, we have a challenge with overheating in summer. So too much solar gain through the windows, the inability of the ventilation system to get rid of heat, and that's impacts on thermal comfort. And in the last kind of few years, the requirements around this have got increasingly tightened up. We now have the new building regulations coming in June, which is Part O, and that's actually looking at the relationship between overheating and energy. So this is only becoming tighter and tighter in terms of its requirements and expectations, and it's increasingly important with the impacts of climate change. In 10, 15, 20 years time, issues of overheating will only be exacerbated. So this is becoming under increasingly stringent kind of rules, requirements and expectations from the planner's side. So what we need to do is we need to demonstrate that we're following this process. Again, it's not just about arriving at the end point, and we need to show the process, and the process is just as important as really how we got there, because that provides our narrative, our argument and justification to the planners as to why we got to where we were. So we really need to hammer home that process and the thinking that it's really, really important. Daylight is obviously something that's been with us for a long time in the planning process. In the London plan, we have its policy D6, and this is where a lot of it is really kind of embedded. So obviously, as a good design and also kind of certain housing quality standards, we need to demonstrate that we have an adequate amount of daylight. And you can see here, this is how it's measured. The right of light technically isn't really a planning requirement, but from obviously a risk and an insurance perspective, we really need to undertake it at planning stage, because we need to understand implications for legal cases and the cost of compensation that might need to be covered later on. And so this is really, really important. And obviously, right of light, if we neglect this and we don't understand what the implications are, it might mean that we have to completely cut back the massing and change the massing of the scheme later on, which can be hugely disruptive, massively kind of costly to rectify, and obviously can throw the whole scheme off balance and off plan. So this is one of those things which can be neglected but can have an enormous impact. So we need to be mindful of this from a risk management perspective. Just something to note: the planning, the standards around daylighting are about to change. So in summer 22, there will be the new standard for daylight, which will be released, and you can just see a comparison here about the current and the new standard, how daylight is going to be measured. It's not just going to be looking at quantity, which is really what we've been doing to date. It's going to look at quality, so the quality of the light and the glare and such things. So when this lands, we should expect the planners to start asking for those, particularly in more built-up urban areas. We should expect this requirement to start being embedded and become a kind of a central expectation of good quality daylight. So that's something to keep your eye out on. So embodied carbon, you've probably heard of, and now we have whole life carbon. This is something that's really kicked in the last few years, and in the last 2 years, the Greater London Authority has done an awful lot of work on embedding this within the policy and being more prescriptive about what they're expecting to see. So what this requires is a life cycle assessment, or LCA. And just for your mind's eye, this diagram obviously is quite busy, but what it really means is we're looking at the building from its product stage, so all the materials, its construction, its assembly, and then its use over 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and then eventually its end of life. And then finally, you probably heard the term circularity or circular economy. That's that bit at the right-hand side, what we call stage D, because you can see these are called life stages and they're broken up into letters. When we talk about circularity and we're asked to produce a circularity statement for planning, this is what we're looking at. It's looking at recovery, reuse, repurposing of building materials for the future. So just in your mind's eye, this is the kind of thing that's being more and more focused on. And initially, maybe 18 months ago, 2 years ago, this wasn't getting much scrutiny, but increasingly more so. There is a lot of emphasis being put on this, and questions being asked as to why we may be falling short of certain benchmarks which the JLA have specified. So this is one which is almost on par with the energy modelling and the other parts of zero carbon, and will increasingly probably be like for like in terms of its importance. So these are really the kind of three ingredients or the three kind of aspects you really need to know about. We have life cycle assessment, and this is really the tool or the method that we use. So the two reports we need to prepare are the whole life carbon and the circular economy statement. And these definitions here are for you to really just describe, I suppose, what we're actually looking at. So when you're looking at these reports, this is what you should be expecting to see. Yeah, the key thing is here we need to demonstrate how it's been calculated, and again the process, the reasons why we've specified certain materials that might be considered high carbon, and if we're not reusing building materials that were on site as part of the circular economy strategy, we need to justify why. So you might be wondering, why are we looking at embodied carbon as well? So this is the second or third iteration of this policy document, and we have the London Plan guidance there. This is really the first kind of regulatory policy instrument in relation to embodied carbon. There's also a bill in, there's also a lobby in Parliament to kind of embed something like this in the building regulations. We'll see how that goes. But the London Plan is really kind of leading the way on embodied carbon, and this is really why. So previously, say 7, 8, 9 years ago, we were modelling to what we called SAP 2012, and then we produced a new version called SAP 10. And basically what all this means is that as the electricity grid is decarbonising, coal's coming off, more renewables are going in, the carbon factor of electricity is getting lower and lower and lower. And as that happens, which is good news, so electricity is now roughly on par or is less carbon intense than gas. That is why we can't get gas boilers through planning, why CHP is a dead technology, and this is what's influencing the specification of technology and servicing strategies on sites now, is because of this carbon factor. And you can see that when we're modelling, say, 8, 9 years ago, the embodied carbon, so that's the carbon related to all the building materials in the assembly, might have been 20 to 25% of the total carbon pie. Now it's 40, 45, maybe even 50, and that's just because the operational carbon emissions are going down because of the decarbonisation of the electrical grid. So it's just putting more and more emphasis on the embodied carbon. And a couple of things to be mindful of when we're going to have to engage with this. So if we do a pre-app and it's a major development, that policy states that we should be completing the GLA Excel sheet, which details some of the preliminary thoughts, ideas as to what we can do to reduce the embodied carbon of the scheme. And then when we go for the outline or detailed planning application, this is where we put in all the numbers and all the kind of detailed calculations. So we don't need to do calculations at pre-app, but we do need to engage, and we do need to show what we have done to reduce carbon in the scheme. And then crucially, this is what I was mentioning before about this kind of these sustainability requirements being conditioned for well after planning approval is given. We now need to produce a post-construction, or really an as-built life cycle assessment study to confirm that what we said we would do at detailed planning submission, i.e. we will get this building down to 500 kilograms of carbon per metre squared. We need to demonstrate that we actually achieved that. So again, more scrutiny, more expectation, more detail. Some of the kind of key things that you might want to consider in terms of general principles. Again, when you're looking at this from your kind of planning or designer kind of perspective, making sure, is this going to get through planning? Is it going to be scrutinised? We want to be looking for these kind of principles, these narratives, these communications. We're talking about longevity, getting rid of waste, adaptability, flexibility, disassembly. All of those kind of key principles need to be embedded throughout these documents. If we're not seeing these, we are not going to have a successful kind of application in relation to whole life carbon. So we need to make sure that these principles and these relationships are kind of addressed and in the documents. And a key thing to understand is that all of these things link: the whole life carbon, the circular economy, and the energy assessment. They all have impacts and influences on one another. So we need to make sure we're kind of circling back and making sure all the relationships between those are joined. Okay, so that's really energy and carbon. There are a whole lot of other environmental requirements which you will obviously be aware of through your experience of going through the planning process. We have obviously everything's related to surface water runoff, flooding, drainage, etc. This increasingly is getting a lot more, I suppose, demanding. This is one of the areas that we're seeing more pushback from the planners. Some aspects of the sustainability kind of strategies that we're putting in tend to sail through quite easily without too much resistance, or without too much challenge, or without too much request for further detail. Flooding, in particular, drainage and sustainable drainage strategies are getting an awful lot of scrutiny. I think there's a sensitivity and a concern around the risk of flooding on many sites, and as you'll be aware, large parts of London are actually quite high risk from flooding. What we also need to be demonstrating is this kind of integration with the bigger picture, and this is the Thames Estuary 2100 plan. So we need to show how we're keying into the overarching kind of Thames strategy. So that's, again, thinking a little bit beyond just our site and thinking on the bigger picture. And you can see here some of the kind of runoff rates and things we need to be demonstrating. But as a key principle, we need to be showing how we're going through this hierarchy, this process. Again, it's not just about the outcome, it's about the process. We need to make this really crystal clear for the planners, the process we've gone through and why we've arrived at the solution that we have. And again, it's much like the energy hierarchy or the waste hierarchy or any of these other disciplines. It's really about reducing water use or the use of the resource, and then finding the most appropriate means until we've got to kind of basically get rid of it or discharge it. As a one thing to look out for, if we're specifying any paving and ground covering that is not permeable, so will not let water permeate through and into the ground, which means it has to be dealt with by the sewers, by the drainage infrastructure, that will be a very, very hard battle for you to have with the planners, because it more or less speaking will be rejected. So wherever there's a flat surface, it needs to be permeable, and we need to be maximising the ability of rainwater to discharge or release into the ground. So something to be very mindful of, and this is something that we just see more and more questions being asked, which tends to, obviously, if we're not addressing this head on, tends to cause delays. So flooding, drainage features, they all feed into the wider, bigger picture of green infrastructure, which leads into, I suppose, the natural environment and ecology and biodiversity. So these are the London Plan policies, and you can probably consider this to be, I suppose, a real kind of gold standard in terms of the expectations, the breadth and the detail around green infrastructure and demands for it. Naturally, because of the urbanised context, there's a big expectation and demand to maximise green infrastructure as much as possible because it's sorely needed. So each of these policies obviously have their respective details. A lot of it is focusing on connectivity and not looking again beyond the red line boundary, not just your site. How does your site integrate with other infrastructure around in the neighbouring locale and connectivity? So again, we can't just have a site specific mentality. We've got to think of the bigger picture. That's something the planners are going to be expecting to see. We need to just make sure we're not obviously having any loss in any kind of green infrastructure or ecology. Where losses are occurring, we need to bend over backwards to explain why and what mitigation measures have been implemented, and where we don't, where we have I suppose a negative impact, just beware we're going to have a hell of a battle trying to justify it. So this is one to really look out for, and we'll come on to this a little bit later from a risk perspective. But broadly speaking, the ecology and green infrastructure piece is one of the highest risk items, because if we get that wrong, we miss something at the survey stage, or rather the planning team and the client team don't recognise or commission a survey early enough, it can have enormous knock-on effects. We've had delays of several months and costs in the tens of thousands for additional surveys and things. It's really one which has an enormous impact if it's not well managed. So biodiversity is very of the moment, and it's a really hot topic. You'll be aware that the Environment Act has really strengthened that, and we have requirements around biodiversity net gain. So you all want to make yourselves familiar with that. It's a real key piece of a policy and something that we need to be looking at, and that all keys into the government's longer term plan to increase biodiversity up and down the country. It's going to be mandatory from winter 23 again. So we're in this kind of, I suppose we're in this kind of implementation phase, or this kind of slow kind of phasing kind of period. But from our experience, what we're seeing is local authorities are already asking for it anyway. They know it's coming, they want it, so they're already asking for it, even though it's not technically mandatory. So this is really something to be wary of. And in terms of the biodiversity units, so you need to calculate the biodiversity units on site. This can be quite expensive. It can be £20,000 per biodiversity unit, which we need to calculate that, and you need to show that we're obviously adding biodiversity units. There are such things as biodiversity offsets, and for example, Oxford has the Trust for Oxfordshire's environment that manages offsets. So if you can't achieve net gain on site, you can pay into the trust, and then that will pay for biodiversity solutions elsewhere within the borough. But as we say, that's £20,000 per unit, so it's not cheap. The key thing here, really, I suppose, is that early engagement. It's very easy to fall foul of this, particularly if we have protected species and we have a whole range of kind of delicate matters to deal with. If we miss that, as you'll be aware, surveys are generally quite time restrictive, and there's only certain periods within the year that they can be undertaken. If we miss that window, we're going to have to wait for that season to come right back around, which means obviously delays and a very unhappy client. So I suppose they're the big picture policy requirements and kind of detail as to what's actually embedded within some of these themes around sustainability. It's probably important just to draw out some of the impacts, or where some of the design disciplines. So how we're thinking about the design disciplines from the planning application, we're looking at, I suppose, 4 key design team members. Other than obviously the sustainability consultant and the planning consultant, the architect, the landscape design, the MEP and the structures. Now, obviously, we know sometimes landscape might not be depending on the size of the scheme, might not be a part of the team, and the MEP might not even be there, or the structures. But generally, when we're looking at this kind of, say, a reasonable size major development, and there will be, and this is something that we really want to get across, and you want to be thinking about how these sustainability requirements, how these environmental requirements, how all of those will impact on the design disciplines. So probably the most obvious one is the architecture, and it's probably the most impacted. So energy, all the zero carbon strategy, that affects the specification, the design, the massing. Overheating is has a huge impact. If you're seeing architectural designs that have glazed facades of 50% and above, you're probably in for quite a substantial overheating challenge, and we could be spending a lot more time trying to optimize the design, trying to tweak all the specifications to make sure it doesn't overheat and meets the policy requirements for summertime temperatures. Air quality, naturally, if we're in an area of poor air quality, we will not be able to specify things like open windows and have natural ventilation strategies, which can be quite impactful. Acoustics, noise, similar thing. Not very noisy areas, that means we can't open windows, and that's very restrictive, and that has impacts on overheating. Ecology, trees, as we know, if we a tree on site of particular importance or merit can cause huge impacts and can drastically affect massing and how we would actually lay out the scheme. And increasingly so whole life carbon, so we're talking about the whole life cycle carbon, that impacts material specifications, and strictly speaking, it should also affect massing. We want to be designing the building, the layout, the general kind of master plan, if that's relevant, to reduce the total volume of materials. And that's something that we're being expected to show. So all of these aspects have an impact, and it really spells out the importance of engaging in one way or another with these disciplines prior to proceeding with producing, you know, kind of concept design plans, because once we've produced the plans and the architect spent 6 to 8 weeks drawing them up, and then we come back and kind of feed in, and we kind of come back and say, no, this isn't going to work because of this reason, we got to change that. Obviously hugely disruptive and can be quite costly. So we really need to make sure that all of these aspects are being considered by the architect and within the architecture. MEP, similar, but probably fewer impacting sustainability themes. Naturally, the energy, obviously, from specification perspective, overheating. Usually, we should look at this a bit of as a kind of a two-step approach, and almost in a tiered approach. We need to get the architecture right first for overheating, and then we go on to the building services. If we have a very inefficient and suboptimal building fabric design, we'll only be chasing our tail and we'll be trying to battle overheating with the building services. So it starts with the architecture, and then we do as much as we can with the architecture, and then we graduate onto the best MEP strategy to reduce overheating. Similarly with air quality, if we're in an area of poor air quality, we might be looking at filtration, restrictions on ventilation, such things, and that can obviously increase the cost and increase the complexity. And again, same story with noise. Landscape. So we naturally, as you would expect, ecology and the arboricultural tree matters are hugely integrated into landscape. We really need to make sure that we are achieving those net gain and biodiversity units, etc. So that's really crucial. And naturally, those sustainable drainage system features, whatever they might be, they all feed into the landscape design, and as does air quality, landscape more broadly, and the kind of the public realm. All of these site factors can feed into improving air quality. And when we're perhaps in a borderline kind of air quality management area where the air quality is not awful, but it's not great, we can use things like the landscape and the site barriers and such things to improve air quality. And that can be a way in which we can, if we can demonstrate that we're making those changes and those optimizations to improve air quality, that can save us going down expensive filtration options and things like that, which is hugely beneficial. So, trade-offs. As we've mentioned, and the whole theme of this presentation really is about joining those dots, and many of these things have consequential and dependencies on, and we need to understand them so we can get through planning as quick and as efficiently as possible, and to manage your risk. So we just want to kind of get across a handful. Obviously there are quite a lot, but we want to get across a handful of trade-offs and relationships and how we deal with them. So the most obvious one is when we're looking at this kind of nexus between energy efficiency, carbon, daylight impacts, daylight quality, occupant comfort, all these kind of things. We're never going to find an answer which really balances or ticks all the boxes. It's always going to be a trade-off. So this here just illustrates 3 designs for an office building that we've been working on, and you can see there where we get into, in the middle one, for example, where it's to have that really fully glazed facade. You can see how we do really well for all of our daylighting, but then thermal comfort and energy efficiency hugely suffers and basically means non-compliance. And then the top one, maybe we could say that's maybe closer to optimum, but then maybe not as good from an energy efficiency perspective. Thermal comfort might be better on the bottom, for example, but then it's less desirable from a daylight. All of these things kind of impact on another, and as soon as we make a change in one, it impacts the other, and that's a key thing to think about when we're thinking about scheduling and timelines. So any disruption or change in one of any significance will have ripple effects. The embodied and operational is quite an important one. So as a rule of thumb, one of the reasons why we need to look at life cycle assessment, apart from it becoming a bigger piece of that kind of overall carbon pie, is that there are fundamental relationships between the two. So until we were looking at embodied carbon a few years ago, often what we were doing was we were specifying building systems, building fabric specifications to reduce the operational carbon. And we do that to tick our magic 35% threshold for the London plan, for example. Maybe to get BREEAM credits or whatever it might be, we'd be pursuing those, and to do that we'd be putting on more PV and maybe going to triple glazing and all these kind of things. But what was happening is every time we made those decisions, we increased the embodied carbon, and the only way to actually check that we're making the big picture work is to calculate both of them. And many times we see kind of inferior strategies that are being specified because they're not really looking at both sides of the coin. So we need to make sure that we're addressing these, and I think it's something to look out for where we have a very aggressive strategy on perhaps the operational carbon, and we need to check that it's not bumping up the embodied carbon, because both will be scrutinised and they'll both have targets. So again, we need to be making sure our design optimises both. So that's just two of the, I suppose, the relationships or trade-offs that we experience. But if we look at all of these, for example, we're trying to really give you an illustration of, I suppose, of how we think about this problem and how we address it. So you can see we have just 5 themes here. The different colours, obviously we have energy, daylight, thermal comfort, embodied carbon, and internal air quality. If we're looking at fabric design here, the impact on those sustainability criteria is on the vertical axis. And then I suppose the architectural, the glazing, the kind of facade design is on the bottom horizontal axis. So what happens? You can see as we change the variables, as we get more and more glazing, it becomes a higher glazed percentage. So something like floor to ceiling glazing at the very end point. There you can see what is this doing? It's worsening our energy savings. It's increasing daylighting, but then it kind of levels off. Internal air quality kind of declines steadily because it's we're using openable windows, so the more facade, more windows to cool, which means more pollution coming in. And then say the embodied carbon, you can see that in that purple line there, it kind of increases and it takes a bit of a step up, and that's where basically we've had to go from double to triple glazing to reduce the impacts on energy savings and other things. So the key point to get across here is that a lot of these relationships aren't linear. So because of that, we can't just assume the optimum point. We've got to understand what it is that we're looking at and understand how all of these things interact with one another. So in reality, one of the kind of, we might want to hover around that point where see the red line and that kind of darker blue line for daylight crossover. Just above, if we look where the word daylight is, we just go north of it. That is probably the optimum point there, where we've probably got enough performance in all of these 5 criteria to satisfy planning. And naturally, if we push further down any one of these, we'll find that the whole scheme goes out of balance and we lose our planning compliance. So our role as multidisciplinary kind of sustainability consultants is to think of this big picture and work out how one affects the other, and make sure that we're doing this and we're minimizing any risk that you might have for delay and increased cost and what have you, because of not understanding the relationships at play. Which takes us on to the penultimate section, which really is risk management. So we want to give you a bit of a, I suppose, a crib sheet and a bit of a brief and a kind of point of reference as to how long these things take, and if we have a problem, if we have a complication or a change in one area or one discipline, what will this mean for you? So broadly speaking, on a medium-sized scheme, this is roughly what we would be looking at for time it would take us to produce that report, that study, that input for the wider project planning team to enable a decision or to whatever it might be. And this is looking at these independently. That's the key thing. So each of these studies and disciplines on your left hand side, they're all independent. And obviously, how we would ideally do this is at stage 1, 2, preferably stage 1. It's not worth us going into building detailed models and spending 2-3 weeks doing lots of complex modeling only to come back and say, yeah, that doesn't work. What we actually want to be doing is kind of a light touch kind of engagement. Have a look at this massing plan, have a look at the rough layout, have a look at the flood risk, have a look at whatever it might be, quick desktop survey type stuff. Appraise what the risk might be, feed into the design team, the planning team, all of the different disciplines, then they can incorporate that into what they're doing, and then they come back with a concept design, and then we can dig into the detail. So that's usually each of executing each of these disciplines has a 3-step approach. It's kind of a preliminary, or rather should have a preliminary engagement at stage 1/2, preferably stage 1. Where all the detail happens, where we build the models, run the reports, etc. at stage 2, and then maybe if we're going stage 2/even a 3, stage 3 planning application, that final iteration, that final check, the little bit of adapting and feedback from the broader team or from the planner about how to message, what have you, and then we're off for application. So that's how we would do these things, and that's how we suggest you do it to optimize time and reduce any complication. In those middle two columns there, we have the likelihood of this risk occurring, and then the impact it will have. And obviously we're ranking it of 1 to 5, but we just want to give you a bit of a feeling as to how we see the risk. So energy and overheating, for example, at 3 out of 5, they're always going to cause a few problems, challenges. That's standard. We know that no design is ever perfect. First off, we've always got to optimize. We're gonna have to change the window sizes, whatever it might be. So we know that, that's fine. But generally we're used to it. It's quite standard. It's optimizing building fabric, a little bit of massing, perhaps floor to ceiling height. It's not the end of the world. So it's got a kind of 2 out of 5 impact. That's fine. What is the risk outcome of like a bit of oversight, or if we don't quite get it right, well, we just got to go back to the drawing board and do another modelling iteration. And what does that generally mean if we've got to kind of address a bit of a complication? It's not the end of the world. It's about 2 weeks, something like that, to go and kind of look at it again, work out a better strategy, optimise, and then come back to the team. Air quality. Generally, we only kind of write an air quality report at stage 2, although we'll come on to that shortly. The likelihood of air quality impacting a scheme in any serious way is probably not that big, because to some extent 50% it's out of your control. 50% of the air quality issue is caused by transport, and there's not much you can do from a building perspective. However, obviously it has impacts on the design. The reason it's got a high impact is because if we get that wrong, or if there's insufficient data and it's been neglected, it can cause quite substantial delays. So for example, we had a scheme just outside London towards Reading, where the local authority data wasn't enough and wasn't adequate, and they were very concerned, increasingly concerned about pollution in this particular area. So what they requested was that basically the project team go back and conduct diffusion tube monitoring. So go and install tubes on site, record the data for 3 months, and then come back and update the modelling. So that delayed the planning by 12 weeks, which was obviously quite an impact. Daylighting, again, you know, a bit of a risk, particularly if you've got ROL, right of light issues, that can cause changes in massing. 3-week delay, not too bad. Acoustics, that can be reasonably impactful, not too bad. But again, the key thing probably to point out again is the ecology. Now, this likely will have some impacts. We know it'll be additional studies, or we might, if it's a tree of particular importance, we're going to have to build around it and work out how to protect it, etc. But the impact can be enormous. Of all of the impacts, ecology in trees can probably be one of the biggest ones to derail an application, as you probably may have experienced. If we get that wrong, if we come on too late in the process, if something's been neglected and we find protected species, and there's need to be protected species surveys and what have you, we can be talking delays of weeks, months, or even longer. So it's one of those key things where if that is not addressed early doors, even if it's just a desktop survey to see what the potential risks could be, we could be talking enormous delays. We've had sites that have experienced £50,000–60,000 costs, completely unexpected, because they didn't do a desktop survey at an early kind of feasibility stage. They got on to stage 2. Wow, we didn't expect this. There was newts on site, whatever it might be. You know, tens of thousands of pounds and weeks and months of delays to get back to where they need to be and to get to a compliant scheme. So really want to look out for. And then BREEAM/SS, which stands for sustainability statement. So obviously, if it's non-domestic, you'd be doing a BREEAM assessment. If it's residential, you might be doing a sustainability statement. However, we would recommend you do a sustainability statement anyway, but this is really not a big deal. This is kind of 1 week. This really sums up the big picture. Nothing too much to be concerned about. So how does all this fit together? So one of the key things to consider here is really the kind of consequential impact. So we can't really do an overheating study until we have information on air quality and acoustics, because if we can't open the windows for ventilation because of those two, then that's the overheating strategy out the window. You know, we can't do a whole life carbon assessment, which basically quantifies all the materials going into the building, until we have a pretty detailed design until we have some costing information from the QS. So that has to happen later. Again, kind of all of these things are interlinked, and this is really just trying to get a kind of get across to you how these kind of disciplines relate to one another. I think it's often perhaps assumed that we can just kind of conduct them all simultaneously, which is not really not possible. And I think there's probably a note to mention here that you can, if you fragment these services too much, there might be reasons why you need a specific consultant or a specific kind of company working on one discipline. But if these are very, very fragmented, one team will complete their report, then send it off to another team. That team looks at it for 2 weeks and comes back and says, no, that doesn't work for us. So we go into this big kind of round robin situation where we're going back and forward, and all this does is just extend and elongate the planning process. So we need a really, really tight coordination between each of these disciplines, and it's very beneficial to kind of have consultants doing handful, if not the majority of these themselves, because then as soon as the problem flagged internally, it can be passed to the different person who's doing the air quality monitoring or the ecology department, and they can address it immediately. So it's really, really important to understand that energy and overheating, for example, they may take 2 weeks to do independently, but what actually happens is you make a change in the architecture, you check it for energy efficiency and zero carbon. If it works, you take the data out of that model, you put it into an overheating model, you run that for 3 days. Does that work? If it does, great. If it doesn't work, then you've got to make changes in the overheating model, then feed that back into the energy model to see if that complies, and you're in this loop. So just really, really careful. Just think about how these things impact on one another and how we can optimize as much as possible. So, which brings us on to I suppose our 4 or 5 top tips for how we can coordinate. Now we can make sure that all aspects related to sustainability are coordinated to maximize a successful application. As we said, many services dependent on one another and have knock-on effects, some bigger than others, some are time, some are cost, and some are technical. But it's really important that we understand how each of these impact another, and we need to be doing spot checks and risk assessments to make sure that changes aren't going to come later on down the line and scupper a whole 4, 6, 8 weeks worth of work. One thing to watch out for is a bit of a technical discipline hot potato. So that's where the architect has got their design, they're very wedded to it, and maybe rightly so, but it doesn't work quite for the MEP, and there's an overheating issue, and then the MEP passes it back to the architect, so, oh, this is something for the architect to resolve, and then we kind of go around in this circle. Similarly, we can have that with many of the sustainability aspects. If the ecologist can be fighting someone who's doing flooding and what have you, and energy and air quality can conflict. So we really need to make sure, and I suppose unfortunately maybe for a planner's perspective, and there might be some need to kind of manage these and make sure there's concessions being made adequately and fairly, and we're not just passing the buck around the different technical disciplines. Probably one of the most important things that we could possibly recommend is doing a risk assessment. So this would be a sustainability risk assessment, and now we would undertake a desktop study at stage 1, and we would look at every single one of these disciplines that we've mentioned today. We would, in about a space of 2 weeks, we could look at all of them from a desktop perspective and give you a risk profile or risk rating for each of these disciplines, and it wouldn't take very long, but we would be able to preempt what was going to happen when we got to stage 2. So it might be an upfront cost of, say, a few £1,000s to just do a top level kind of risk assessment to see what challenges we might have. However, the vast majority of times this will pick up things like, okay, there's risk for newts on sites, or actually it's an air quality management area, so we can't do this. We might have to change the massing, move the bedrooms away from the main road, whatever it might be. All of these kind of impacts which hugely elongate the planning application process and could impact on cost. We can usually pick up at a stage 1 risk assessment, and that saves a whole lot of time and an awful lot of cost at stage 2. So if anything, if we could take one thing away from you, we would ask you to undertake a risk assessment, a high-level screening at stage 1 as early as you possibly can before getting into, right, we need an energy assessment now and a 3-week study. Do a screening kind of job early on, get a sense, and then plan for longer term. And then finally, make it easy for the local authority planners. And this is one of the big challenges that we're experiencing as sustainability is getting more complex, more challenging, and the expectations are rising. It's harder and harder to get the message across and to demonstrate to the local authority planners that we've done the right thing, and whatever we're proposing is the right and most sustainable solution for the scheme. And I'm sure it's probably fair to say that there's a lack of expertise and awareness within local authorities. Rightly so. They're not deep experts in one particular area, and they need to cover an awful lot of ground. So it's our responsibility as a technical team putting together a planning application to communicate this in the simplest and most straightforward way possible. So no ambiguity, something that the planners can really engage with and say, right, this is a hard and fast commitment or performance level that I can say clearly meets the requirements of the policy. And it's really important that we make that clear and concise. One good way to consider doing this is to write a sustainability statement for the entire sustainability discipline and embed all of the requirements into one report. We would strongly suggest you do that. And then that almost serves a bit like an exec summary for the planners. They're not having to go around between 8 different reports and dig into page 13 and find out what's said on that page, because it's not very practical. And that's where we see a lot of confusion. There's many times we get comments and pushback from some planners, and they just miss the data. And it's just because it's in a total of 200 pages perhaps of total environmental documents. So we would strongly suggest you produce a sustainability statement which really aggregates and just runs a thread through every aspect of sustainability, and that can be 8 pages long, maybe even less, but it just tells the planner every single thing they need to know and where to find it, and that massively increases the success and limits any delays. So thank you all very much for listening. I hope some of that was insightful and useful and informative, and if there are any questions, please do say. So we have a few minutes left, so I'll just answer a couple of questions that I think were emailed beforehand, which was very kind and very thoughtful. So thank you those for being forward thinking. Okay, so someone's asking about yeah, I suppose how the trade-offs or the kind of the pros and cons of having multiple services delivered by one organisation. So we obviously in our position we find it's usually better and more efficient for us because we can kind of coordinate and troubleshoot and pick up any problems early doors. There are obviously instances where we might have a particularly challenging site, and you might need a really dedicated specialist in one area that can deal with a very detailed problem, or maybe has a really good track record with the planner. And yes, maybe in that instance it would make sense to obviously kind of get different specialists or different kind of teams to work on specific things. But generally, I think as a general rule of thumb, we would encourage all planners to consider compiling services and disciplines where possible. So kind of have the same consultant perhaps do energy, overheating, air quality, roll it into one, and then perhaps if you can have the same same consultant do ecology and flooding, or whatever it might be, because where they have these links and these impacts and these interdependencies, if we have two separate parties, it can really elongate the process. So I would just really encourage you to think about where the links and the relationships sit, and try and aggregate as much as possible and put them within kind of one sphere of influence, so we're not having fragmentation. I think we have another question coming. Okay, yeah, so a question about the 2022 daylight standards. So it's been delayed for quite a while. The BRE have taken quite a long time to do it, and the problem we had was that a lot of the daylight standard used to look at average daylight factor, and which is basically your average over the whole floor plate. So you don't really get a very good idea of quality, you know, and you can basically, with average daylight factor, providing it's not, you know, like blinding sunlight at the window and pitch black at the back of the room, you would kind of average the result, and as long as you've got the average daylight factor across the whole zone or floor as a result, you could kind of tick the box. Thankfully, the new daylight standard has recognised that this is an oversimplification and isn't actually helpful, and we're kind of looking at quality, so it's putting more emphasis on that. We'll now have to do a glare assessment. I'm not sure if you're aware, you can that's also cropped up in the London plan as well. Glare is kind of quite an issue, and obviously in urban environments we kind of, it's an issue with kind of adjacent buildings, and also one of the you know, if you're putting kind of quite substantial amounts of glazing in certain facades, and depending on the room geometry and form, you can have areas where you're in kind of very strong direct light, and then areas where you're overshadowed, and those rooms, for example, are really not great. And then we'll be seeing probably the implications of that will probably be more emphasis on shading solutions, so that will affect the architecture probably, and probably fenestration design might have to be a bit more sophisticated. And yeah, I think those kind of perhaps deep plan rooms that you might get, and where the average daylight factor, as long as you have enough glazing at the front of the front aspect of the zone or the room, as long as you had enough glazing there, you can kind of offset the fact that it was dark at the back of the room. That won't be as acceptable anymore, so it might have impacts on size of rooms and depth of plan and things like that as well. So yeah, I think we're going to see that that it will probably take a while before it's adopted, but much like the biodiversity kind of offsetting and the kind of the biodiversity credits and what have you, I think we'll see this come in, but even before it's formally kind of adopted any policy, I think we'll start seeing planners asking, well, where are you in relation to it? And that's what we've seen that with quite a few. We saw it actually with whole life carbon as well, and a number of other aspects. It's kind of I suppose it's not in policy, but it's the planners saying, what are you doing? And they're asking the questions kind of more politely, and kind of trying to encourage you to engage as much as possible. So I would expect that probably towards the end of the year, but it might have an impact on architecture. I think that's the key thing to take from it. And if you're seeing deep plan rooms appear on the kind of concept design of the architecture, south facing, greater than 50% kind of glazed area to wall area, and not really considering the use of shading and things like that, I would say it's probably very likely that you're going to have daylighting issues and overheating issues, and I think you want to flag that as soon as possible, so we don't get really far down the concept design and find that it doesn't work. We need to go back to the drawing board. Okay, well, thank you all very much for attending, and I hope you found it useful, and we will be sharing a video of the presentation afterwards. And yes, have a good day, and thank you all again.